The concerns in the region about Iran targeting oil facilities. And there are significant concerns about how this war could disrupt the global economy.
Oil and gas prices spiked today as the regional conflict escalated and shipping was disrupted in the Strait of Hormuz. About 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flows through the strait every day.
Straits of Hormuz are this choke point in the Persian Gulf. 20% of the world's oil passes through there, and right now you've got ships essentially parked on either side of the strait.
If global energy markets ever needed a moment that reveals just how fragile international supply chains truly are, this is it. One of the most critical shipping corridors on the planet has suddenly fallen silent. Tanker movement across the Gulf has slowed to a halt, and nations that depend heavily on Middle Eastern oil are now rushing to secure fuel before supplies tighten even more. At the center of this disruption is a country that quietly built an alternative route long before the crisis appeared. Canada now holds access to one of the few large energy supplies that bypass the turmoil entirely, and the ripple effects are already beginning to reach American fuel prices. The Strait of Hormuz has always carried enormous importance within the global energy system because this narrow waterway connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean and serves as the primary exit point for oil and liquefied natural gas leaving the Middle East. Under normal circumstances, nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through that single corridor, and roughly 100 tankers travel through the strait each day, carrying crude and gas toward markets in Asia, Europe, and North America. Once tensions involving Iran escalated and military threats intensified, that corridor effectively shut down as shipping companies began pulling vessels out of the area while insurance coverage disappeared and naval tensions pushed commercial traffic away from the region. The result transformed one of the busiest shipping routes on Earth into an unsettling standstill where vessels loaded with massive quantities of crude suddenly had nowhere to move. According to maritime data from Lloyd's List, close to 200 tankers became stranded in the strait and surrounding Gulf waters after shipping activity collapsed, leaving thousands of seafarers trapped inside a dangerous conflict zone while waiting for a situation that nobody can confidently predict. Some vessels remain anchored near the coastline of Dubai. Others are scattered across the Gulf. Every tanker represents millions of barrels of oil that cannot reach international markets. One crew member aboard a crude tanker described the moment the crisis erupted while the vessel was loading oil at an industrial terminal somewhere in the Gulf region. Orders first came to halt the loading process after explosions lit up the sky in the distance. Then hours later, another command instructed the crew to resume filling the ship despite the chaos unfolding nearby. The tanker ultimately carried more than 1 million barrels of crude oil while communication systems began to fail. GPS signals vanished and the crew waited in darkness while military aircraft thundered overhead. Now that vessel sits completely motionless with more than 20 seafarers on board, including workers from India and the Philippines, sending occasional messages to their employer while hoping the violence surrounding them never reaches the ship. From inside the cabin, the crew member described how flashes from distant explosions sometimes illuminate the sky while fighter jets streak overhead, creating a strange atmosphere where routine work continues even as a major conflict unfolds nearby. Limited internet access and disrupted satellite signals make communication difficult, forcing the crew to rely on brief messages to reassure family members that everyone remains safe. The tanker carries enough food and desalinated water to sustain the crew for around 60 days, although rationing may eventually become necessary if the shutdown lasts longer than expected. International maritime unions have begun receiving urgent appeals from sailors trapped across the region as the closure drags on, with many workers asking whether evacuation or crew replacement might be possible. Leaders at the International Transport Workers Federation say seafarers often remain invisible during geopolitical crises, even though global trade depends heavily on their labor. The organization represents more than 2 million maritime workers and is now facing growing pressure to assist crew members who suddenly find themselves stranded in one of the most volatile shipping regions in the world. Stephen Cotton, the Federation's General Secretary, explained that seafarers are civilians who simply happen to be performing their jobs in a region that has suddenly become extremely dangerous. Maritime unions are now attempting to determine whether crew members who wish to leave their ships can be repatriated safely. Ship owners, however, have warned that the surrounding waters currently function as a no-go zone for movement. The logistical challenge grows even more complicated because replacing crews inside an active conflict zone would require workers willing to accept enormous risks simply to step aboard a tanker. Reports suggest that at least 6 vessels have already been attacked in the area, and 2 seafarers have lost their lives during the escalating violence. While a major explosion near the coast of Kuwait involving an oil tanker was reported earlier this week. Each new incident deepens the uncertainty surrounding the region and pushes shipping companies further away from attempting transit through the strait. Marine insurers have responded by sharply raising premiums or withdrawing coverage entirely, making commercial voyages through the corridor nearly impossible for the foreseeable future. Shipping companies now describe the corridor as financially impossible to navigate, even for operators who might otherwise consider accepting the risks. The economic consequences of this disruption stretch far beyond the Gulf because the global oil market depends on continuous movement from production fields to refineries around the world. When a route responsible for carrying nearly 20% of the planet's energy supply suddenly stops functioning, prices respond almost immediately and supply chains begin scrambling for alternatives. Every country that depends on Middle Eastern oil must now locate new sources, while millions of barrels remain stranded aboard tankers that cannot safely depart the region. One country, however, sits largely outside this crisis with an entirely different route to global markets, and that country is Canada. Canadian energy exports move primarily through pipelines and coastal terminals that do not pass anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea, allowing shipments to continue even while Middle Eastern routes collapse. A major pipeline connecting Alberta's oil sands to Canada's Pacific coast now transports around 890,000 barrels of crude oil each day toward shipping terminals where tankers can sail west across the Pacific toward Asian markets. The journey from Canada's Pacific coast to Asia takes roughly 10 days, nearly half the time required for Middle Eastern cargo traveling the traditional route when the Strait of Hormuz remains open. In the current situation, the Middle Eastern route cannot operate at all, leaving many nations suddenly aware that one of the few stable suppliers sits thousands of miles away in North America. Canada also controls enormous energy reserves that place the country in a powerful position during any global supply shock. Canadian oil reserves total approximately 163 billion barrels of proven crude, placing the country fourth in the world behind only Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Production levels approach 6 million barrels per day when combining conventional drilling with output from Alberta's vast oil sands operations. Those figures allow Canada to supply a substantial portion of international demand without relying on vulnerable shipping lanes that pass through geopolitical flashpoints. Natural gas exports add another layer to Canada's growing energy influence. A major liquefied natural gas terminal on the coast of British Columbia now sends LNG cargo toward Asia and operates at a capacity capable of supporting roughly 170 tanker shipments each year when running at full output. South Korea already purchases Canadian LNG from that facility, creating a direct energy connection that bypasses the geopolitical tension surrounding Middle Eastern gas supplies. These resources have gradually transformed Canada from a regional exporter into a country capable of filling gaps in global markets whenever disruptions appear elsewhere. For years, Canadian producers sold the overwhelming majority of their crude to the United States because pipelines flowed south into American refineries while alternative export routes barely existed. That arrangement kept Canadian oil prices significantly lower than global benchmarks since producers had limited options for selling their supply. The price discounts sometimes reached remarkable levels. Canadian crude occasionally traded for $40 to $60 less per barrel than international oil prices. Meanwhile, Middle Eastern producers often sold their output for only about $10 below benchmark rates. American refineries benefited enormously from that arrangement because Canadian producers had little leverage to demand higher prices when their entire export system depended on a single customer. The situation begins to look very different once the Strait of Hormuz shuts down and global markets start searching for reliable supplies. When benchmark oil prices climb toward $100 per barrel because shipments from the Gulf cannot move, Canadian crude suddenly carries far more value than it did under the old system. Buyers across Asia and Europe recognize that Canadian oil travels along secure routes and therefore represents a dependable alternative. While instability continues across the Middle East, new demand has already begun appearing from countries that rarely purchased Canadian energy before. India stands near the top of that list because the nation imports roughly 90% of its oil and previously relied heavily on shipments passing through the Strait of Hormuz. With fewer than 10 days of emergency reserves available in storage, India faces urgent pressure to secure new suppliers capable of delivering crude quickly. During recent diplomatic discussions, an Indian official reportedly told Canadian representatives that India would purchase whatever Canada is offering, a statement that reflects the severity of the current shortage. A country with more than 1 billion people cannot afford to let its energy supply fall into uncertainty, especially during a global disruption that has already forced markets to rethink where the world's most reliable oil might come from next. The sudden loss of Middle Eastern shipments forces decision-makers in New Delhi to pursue any reliable alternative before the situation grows even more severe. India cannot allow its energy system to collapse, and the disappearance of such a major supply corridor pushes leaders to search urgently for new partners capable of delivering oil without delay. Japan faces similar exposure because the island nation imports nearly all of its energy resources and relies heavily on maritime routes to keep refineries operating. South Korea already